Texan takes tournament title. The Invitational starts with a bang. Aussies pronounce Italian words. For the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, I'm David Hood, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, February 2021, and Happy Valentine's Day. For our feature story, diplomacy is just a fun game, right? It has nothing serious to teach us about history, geography, or interpersonal skills, right? Au contraire, mon ami. Our game has been used for decades by university professors and school teachers alike in ways both scholarly and socially to interact with students and improve the learning experience. Some hobbyists can point to a teacher as part of their diplomacy origin stories, while others have had the privilege of introducing our game to younger generations as teachers. For our panel discussion today, we'll hear from a DIP teacher and a DIP student, and then I'll interview a DIP innovator responsible for creating an online diplomacy module for use by teachers. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. The Cascadia Open has been held in Vancouver, British Columbia for years, but this year, Chris Brand's diplomacy tournament was held virtually on January 30th. Ed Sullivan from Houston, Texas, came out on top of this two-round event featuring unlimited time games and live coverage right here on DBN. Sullivan scored a 20-center solo win in round two, with solos also scored by second-place finisher Jackson Roberts and third-place finisher Matthew Krill. Cascadia was the last qualifying event for the Diplomacy Broadcast Network Invitational, so the competition was hot and fierce, with hobbyists coming out of the woodwork from all over the place to participate. Some guy from the news even showed up. Speaking of the DBNI, the first two rounds of this inaugural spectacle of virtual face-to-face play between 28 top players from the season were held on February 13, with two boards each round. Marcus Zylstra from the United Kingdom and Australian Peter McNamara achieved 18-center solos on their boards and thus have set a really high bar for our other competitors going into round two. Round two takes place on Saturday, February 20th. The top 7 finishers overall from all the rounds will advance to a final showdown on February 27th. Russ Dennis of Michigan and London, England resident Conrad Woodring topped their respective boards, thus also taking significant momentum into round two. As always, the diplomacy action can be viewed on the Diplomacy Broadcast Network YouTube channel and Twitch channel in recorded form, or you can catch live coverage of both of these round two games on February 20th at 2 p.m. and 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Diplomacy has been played in the French language for almost as long as the game has existed. The francophonic hobby was once one of the largest in the world, including a whole circuit of face-to-face tournaments throughout France and Belgium. With the recent demise of the primary website for online play in French, something was very much needed to turn things around. Enter Les Sauveurs, Nicolas Sahuguet, Cyril Sevin, Les Sarlanen, and Christophe Bourget. Literally, folks, pardon my French during this segment. They have organized the Championnat du Monde Francophone Virtual de Diplomatie, the French language virtual diplomacy championship. It's going to be held on March 19th through 21st, with one round that Friday, 2 on Saturday, and a top board to be held that Sunday. For more information on this event, as well as on the new French language Discord server being used to resurrect the francophonic hobby, join the VWDC Discord server using the link described in the description field below this broadcast. Oh, and bonne chance. Speaking of the virtual world diplomacy community, this Discord server has been the source of much diplomacy activity in the past couple of months, including the hosting of virtual Cascadia and the DBNI, as well as the launch of a joint project with a number of other hobbyists called the Club Growth Initiative. CGI includes the publication of a how-to guide for DIP hobbyists looking to start a local club, the eventual incorporation of a network of appointed ambassadors through the NADF and other regional hobbies to act as resource persons in their geographic areas, and the recent launch of the face-to-face registry. Hobbyists submit their names and general locations to the registry, which will provide the data needed for folk to find each other for face-to-face play once this pandemic finally goes away. Look for the how-to guide and a link to the registry on the connections page of the NADF website, which is thenadf.org. The action never stops in the world of diplomacy today. Just 1 week after the DB&I crowns the Invitational champ on February 27th, the Tour of Britain virtual face-to-face tournament will begin the dip season in earnest. This event will hold 2-day matches during 4 different weekends throughout the year and is also being hosted on the VWDC Discord server. Contact head honcho Gary Sturley at the link provided below. But after the Tour of Britain, the events just keep a-coming. The Virtual Diplomacy League begins Season 2 play on March 13th, housed on that very same VWDC server. The fine folks in Australia have COVID on the run, so they're going to have a real live face-to-face event, PoppyCon, to be held March 26th through 28th at Melissa Call's house in Melbourne. Check out the Facebook page link for that event listed below this broadcast. Other events we have to look forward to are Virtual Whipping, which is the tournament usually held in San Jose, California, coming up in April, a Springtime for Carnage virtual event in early May, and DixieCon coming up over Memorial Day weekend. More details on these neato cool shindigs will be provided in next month's edition of Deadline News. The YouTube channel Legendary Tactics has released another awesome diplomacy-related video, and this one is a doozy. Virtual Diplomacy League champion Tanya Gill of Ottawa, Ontario, makes a guest appearance on the show to deliver, count them, 42 tips on how to play Austria-Hungary in a game of diplomacy. Noted Austria specialist Tanya leaves no stone unturned as she gives sage counsel to red peace pushers everywhere on strategy and tactics to be used throughout the game, from openings to the in-game solo pushes. You can find this and all other diplomacy-related Legendary Tactics videos by finding the link listed on the media page of the North American Diplomacy Federation website, again, the NADF.org. DBN is privileged to highlight the tremendous recent activities of our other media partners in the world of diplomacy. Brother Board's Diplomacy Dojo podcast series dropped an interesting episode about how to signal intentions to other players while participating in the negotiation-less gunboat. Florida Man and his guest Owl analyzed just how many fleets it should take to solo with each of the 7 great powers. The Diplomat series on YouTube uses 4 recent episodes to review the Cascadia games of Russ Dennis, who, by the way, did not win the tournament, and Ed Sullivan, who, by the way, did. And those fellas at the Diplomacy Games podcast, Amby and Kaner, well, they certainly break new diplomacy media ground by explaining in a recent episode how to pronounce various Italian dishes using different Australian dialects, or was that Italian? Riveting, let me tell you. You can find links to all of DBN's media partners on the media page of the NADF website. The diplomacy hobby is really about relationships, and sometimes even about romance. My friends Lori and Joe Wheeler in Pennsylvania can tell us a thing or two about how diplomacy can build and strengthen human relationships. Let's do a very special Valentine's Day interview with Mr. and Mrs. Sloth. Lori and Joe, welcome to the show. First, can you two give us your respective diplomacy origin stories, starting, of course, with Lori?
I picked up a CD-ROM that had diplomacy with a horrible AI, but it directed me to the diplomatic pouch. And my first GM was Andy Bartoloni.
Oh, my. That is quite an introduction to the hobby.
He invited me to first Tempest, and there was a sniper in DC. And then he invited me to DixieCon, which I went. And then after that, I came to DC to play the following year and met Joe.
So, Joe, how did you get started in diplomacy?
Well, I played a couple times in college and then didn't pay any attention to it for a little while, and then rediscovered the online hobby and randomly drove down to a house game to play that I found online. And that turned out to be Tim Richardson and that crew. So that's how I fell into the hobby. And
So you both came in through the PTKS, basically.
Yeah.
How did you get the nickname Sloth, Joe?
Well, I don't think we really have enough time on this show to get into the full story, but I am happy to tell that story in person to anyone that I meet. I'll just say the really short version is it's from college, and it's from the dorm pothead living across the hall from me, mishearing what somebody was yelling at me early in the morning.
Wow. I'm sure that the expanded version of that story will be the focus of a future TV show, but not this one. So since the focus of this segment is on Valentine's Day, Lori, let me follow up on something you said. You and Joe met at at an event in the Washington, D.C. area, and were there immediate fireworks, or did this have to take a while?
Well, I knew he was a friend of Andy's and a few other people, and he was sleeping in a chair because, being one of the DC board members, he did not get to play that round. And I felt sorry for him and went over and handed him my room key and said, there's an extra bed. And he went up and took a 6-hour nap.
I mean, I'm hearing a Barry White soundtrack in the background when you say, "Where's my room?" I mean, I'm hearing something else that maybe is not intended, but I don't know if that probably speaks more to me than about me than about you all. Well, Lori, to be serious for a second, what do you think? The fact that you obviously started your relationship and got to know him, but also you mentioned friendships with people like Andy Bartolone and this game is sometimes described as the game that's been ending friendship since 1959. Give us the counterpoint to that.
Probably 20 of my best friends are diplomacy players. And now we're playing more things like Terraforming Mars and that type of thing. But they're still very good friends. And one of the few people or few groups of people that we actually saw this summer. So.
And Joe, what do you think about that? Is this a game that can help establish relationships, or does it really have the potential to harm relationships, or both?
I have to echo what Lori said. Some of my deepest, most long-lasting friendships have come out of this hobby, and I really think it lives up to that motto of I would trust these people with my mortgage, just not my dots.
Yeah, I mean, that's an old saying, but there's a lot of truth to it. Well, I guess I should focus back on your relationship. Did the gaming play any role in deepening your relationship before you became a married couple?
Well, hang on. I have to back up a little and kind of correct. We did not meet in DC. We met before that at a little thing called DixieCon. You may have heard of it.
I'm passingly familiar.
But yeah, the first time we actually met was I showed up at DixieCon, and Buffalo walked out to me and said, "This woman has a trunk full of pork. I need you to move from her car to my car."
Well, that's a fairly common thing to be hearing at DixieCon. There's a trunk full of pork that needs to be moved from one place to the other.
So,
but that is an amazing way to meet.
Yeah. So we weren't actually introduced, but that is the first time we met.
Well, Lori, do you think the gaming played a role in strengthening and deepening and making your relationship more permanent?
Maybe I think we got to know each other because of the long hours you're spending at a table. It's not a 30-minute game. You're there for quite a few hours. Um, you're going to dinner afterwards. You're having drinks at the bar afterwards. Whatever. You're just spending more quality time with someone. So I think it did.
Joe, what do you think this says, if anything, about the potential for this game to help people make new friendships that maybe are looking to make new friendships?
Well, I think if you're going to look for a game for that, this is the game to do it. And I will say one of the reasons I got into diplomacy as opposed to other games is because I used to help organize tournaments just in general for things. And one of the most antisocial things I ever saw was at a chess tournament I was running, where one of the guys was sitting at the table waiting for his opponent to show up. The opponent shows up, sticks out his hand and says, "Hi, I'm John." And the other guy says, "I'm Black," and hits the timer. And I did not ever want to get involved into a game culture that was the norm. So the social aspect of diplomacy really spoke to me. So if you're going to look for a game to build relationships, this is the one to do.
Well, that's really quite a story. It's definitely not something you would ever see at a diplomacy tournament, really, that I'm aware of. So, all right, you are now, or will be as soon as this airs, the most famous couple in diplomacy. So give us some final thoughts about diplomacy and the social aspects of the game, starting with Lori. Final thoughts about this.
Don't play with your spouse or best friend.
Sloth, you agree, right?
I haven't played an actual game and I don't know how long, so I don't play with anyone anymore.
Well, I've seen you play some games in the last 12 months, virtual games at least.
In diplomacy, people assume that you're going to be working together if you're married.
Or against each other, in either way.
But Joe and I are very competitive when we play each other. And so, I will fight him before I fight someone else. But it's hard to do that if people are expecting you to work together. So it's never easy to play together.
The takeaway I'm getting from that is I will fight Joe before I fight anyone else, which apparently is the key to a strong and lasting marital relationship. So on that note, I will bid you both adieu and thank you for being in this very special Valentine's Day segment of Deadline.
Thank you so much.
Now let's get to our panel discussion about using diplomacy in the classroom. I have with me here today Chris Barfield, a longtime hobbyist from North Carolina who first learned the game from a teacher in the 8th grade, and Dave Roberts, a high school teacher in Washington State with experience using diplomacy as a classroom teaching tool. Dave, let me start with you. What gave you the idea to start using diplomacy to teach to your students?
Well, first of all, it was actually introduced to me also in 8th grade. But then when I started teaching world history, I remembered the game, and I just, simulations, projects, group work, that type of stuff, especially early on in my career, was stuff I needed to get through the day. So I was able to get my hands on a diplomacy game, and then colonial diplomacy, and just to make the things come alive when you're teaching. For me, a lot of it is colonial diplomacy. That's what I use in my classroom. So to teach, I don't know. I think it's simple, but just to have a little game where kids are actually they're involved in the Opium War. When we're talking about the Opium War, the Russo-Japanese War happens on the colonial diplomacy map. Britain is spread all over the world because Britain was spread all over the world. I mean, these things actually happening where they're a part of it. It makes it come alive. It helps them remember those things, and it's just a more exciting way to learn.
That makes a lot of sense. How do you actually use it in the classroom? Could you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Basically, when we start the Industrial Revolution each year. Sorry for the history lesson that you all probably already know, but the Industrial Revolution created a demand for raw materials, sources of labor, and new markets. And so the dots on the game are those three things. You're trying to go out and get those three things. That's what the dots are. So I really just started when we start the Industrial Revolution, we get the background, and then we start showing what the Industrial Revolution did through imperialism. And so every day students walk into the room. We don't sit down. We don't do anything. We just come to the board and they start strategizing, figuring out their moves. They're usually groups of about 3 or 4 students are in a group. And, they're just around the board. They're figuring out their moves. They're going out to the corners of the room and writing. They're trying to go talk to other people. And so for about 10 minutes at the beginning of the period, that's just what's happening. And then at 10 minutes are up, all the papers have to get turned in. We all stand around the board. We make the moves. I make my little jokes or my little stories about, oh, Russia won this Russo-Japanese war. That's not actually what happened in real life. And I tell that story, so I do those types of things. And because the game is consistent, I can always talk about those things. So like I mentioned, I can talk about the Boxer Rebellion when Britain or when all of Europe is in China. I can talk about the Boxer Rebellion and that type of stuff. So anyway, that's how it happens. And then after that 10 minutes are up, they want to play more. And I say, go sit down, let's learn, let's do some stuff. And then the next day they come back in and we do it again on the next move.
All right. I think I speak for everyone in the diplomacy hobby when I say, why could I not have had Dave Roberts as a high school history teacher?
I think it has something to do with your age.
It does, actually. It's a logical impossibility for this to have occurred. But there should have been a Dave Roberts in my high school.
That's fair. I don't know if the students that have me right now are that envious, but yeah.
Well, that brings me to the other follow-up. How are your students responding to this use of colonial diplomacy in the classroom?
It's the highlight of the year. I think I mentioned that before in the one interview with Brandon, but it is the highlight of the year. Students that I'll see 20 years later that I had in class will ask me if we're still playing that game. It's an interesting thing about just the hobby in general that I've done this for 20 some years and didn't know about these. I didn't know about Cascadia, which is not, it's something I could have been doing for 20 years. So the students think that they ask me, did you make this game? Did you make it up? Did you, like that type of stuff? So it is, I love it. It's great for just the educational process. And yeah, kids love it. Well, actually, let me say this. This game we know is not for everyone.
Yeah.
And so there are students who they want to disengage from the drama and that type of stuff. But even that is a good lesson. And hey, we're using this to learn a history lesson. We are playing a game. Do the best you can, and most of us end up losing anyway.
Well, some of the time. Others of us do pretty well, apparently, Dave Roberts. All right, Chris, let's move to you. Your diplomacy origin story is a little different from what Dave is describing. So tell us how you intersected with diplomacy when you were in school.
Well, I did actually have a teacher who used the game in his classroom, but he didn't use it in as much of a structured way that it sounds like Dave is using it. Ours was more like we were some kids that didn't fit in with the general culture at our school, didn't really enjoy going to the lunchroom, and our math teacher in 8th grade said, you know what, I'll give you a pass every day. Come in during your lunch and you can play diplomacy. And it got pretty popular. We used to have almost like 3 boards at the same time. And he was really creative. He took like FedEx boxes and pasted a map on one of the conference maps on. And then we used different colored push pins to keep our place because we could only get through a round or two every lunch period. But we did that, and then it was free reign to negotiate the entire rest of the day until the next time we met up again. So you'd have people running to communicate between class and sneaking notes into lockers. It was awesome. It was a lot of fun. And so after we got into that, I moved on to high school and didn't have that opportunity anymore. So I started playing online. I think there was a website called Redscape that was pretty popular at the time. I think since it's probably not one of the premier places to go. But that's where I started and eventually found the hobby.
Well, I very, very, very well remember the first time I met you, Chris, because I think you were 14.
That's right.
And you and a bunch of your buddies came to DixieCon. Tell us about how that experience went.
Yeah, I think it was online that we just heard about this tournament live face to face with people from all over the country, and it was taking place 30 minutes from where I lived. So, I convinced my parents to let me go, and I called a couple of my friends up and got their parents let us go, and we piled in the car and came over and showed up at the basement at Granville Towers for our first DixieCon.
I remember it very well because whoever's parent brought you in there, I had to convince them it was okay for them to leave you with us.
Yeah, that was my dad. He was a little skeptical.
I totally remember that. So do you think the game had a positive influence on you and your friends when you were in the 8th grade?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think games in general are really great on two levels. On the one hand, you have the conceptual and cognitive skills that they exercise, planning ahead, thinking about balance of power strategy, things like that, but also the social emotional aspect of like communicating with somebody or having, to put yourself in their shoes to see what they want, or, be a good sport at the end of it after you've been so emotional. And I think all of those things are transferable, as you go on the rest of your life.
Yes, folks, we call this product placement. Now that I've broken that fourth wall, let me go back to you, Dave. Your son Jackson has certainly leapt feet first into virtual play this season in the diplomacy hobby. He just took second place at Cascadia and made the DB&I field. Do you expect others of your students to keep playing this game outside of the classroom setting?
I think now that I know what opportunities are out there for them, because like I said before this spring, I didn't even know what backstabber or played. I didn't even know about these things. I mean, my maps are what's on my wall behind me right there. That's what I know of the game, and that's how we played it. So now that I know about that stuff, and when the students that really get into it and kind of have a knack for the game and want more of it, now I can actually say, hey, there's opportunities. I don't know how much I'd want to push them to. There's opportunities that if they want to go look at them, they can. And I mean, Jackson has the right demeanor for it to handle the ebb and flow. So I don't know that I would. I will definitely, now that I know about it, I'll let kids know that this is an opportunity beyond just my classroom, and I think some of them will take advantage of that.
Well, I know you're the teacher, but have you learned anything in the process of using the game in your classes that you think might be relevant to other teachers out there who are watching this or thinking, maybe I should use it in my class? You learned any lessons about how others might be able to use that?
Yeah, it's interesting because for me, it's a world history game. I'm even new to the idea of the strategy and worrying about that, trying to win. It's a game about world history for me, but it's also, I don't know if I would use it in a class, but it's a philosophy game. It's a sociology. It's a psychology. It's a goodness sakes. It's a government game. I had a student who was kind of the leader of his group, and he executed just a huge stab on 2 countries, and then was sick for the next 3 days in a row. And and so the leader of the country is gone after pulling this off, and the rest of them have to pick up the pieces. So kind of that civil, I mean, there's legitimate rebellions within groups when you have a 3 to 4 person group. So there's civil wars within the bigger war. So I mean, to answer your question, you can use this in a lot of different ways. For me, I use all of that stuff, the psychology, sociology, philosophy, and government. And then, like Chris, you were saying, like for after the AP exams in my classes, I just do it for fun. I have the colonial diplomacy during the year, but then AP exams are done. I pull out the World War I map and, hey, who wants to play? And we go for it. So I don't know if I answered your question. It can teach a lot of things. I'm using it every year in my class. That's what I can say.
Well, Chris, you've had some experience teaching chess. I know when you moved to the Caribbean for a while, you were teaching chess to young people. What do you think about diplomacy as a teaching tool from your experience, both as a student back in the day and also teaching games to folks when you were down in the Caribbean?
Yeah, well, I think that students are naturally competitive. or a lot of them are. And I think that choice in the kind of games you want to play can be suited to whoever's style of communication might be there. So maybe, like Dave said, diplomacy is not for everybody. It's very kind of aggressive. You need that kind of attitude. You need to be willing to lie, or at least be comfortable in an environment with intrigue. But then you have games like chess, which really play into the strengths of introverted people that really like thinking in their mind and just want to focus on the aspects that they can control and try to control them perfectly. You also have great games for socializing and working cooperatively. So there's really a flavor for everybody. But I think what makes diplomacy so valuable as a teaching tool is because it emulates real life in a way that most other games don't. Most other games have a set of rules, you can understand them, and then you try to min-max as you play. But with diplomacy, no matter how good you think you are and how technically correct your strategy might be, if you can't get other people on board, if you can't create a shared vision, if you can't build a coalition, if you can't make friends, you won't be successful. And in that sense, I think it's a really good training ground and an opportunity for young kids to make mistakes and practice scenarios they might experience in the real world.
Well, let me ask about a counterpoint to that, because during my research for this story, I did hear some negative experiences that teachers had using diplomacy with students. For students that couldn't handle sort of the emotional, psychological aspects of being stabbed or being in that kind of high pressure environment, or playing in a tournament with grown-ups and having to deal with that kind of level of stress. Dave, do you have any reaction to that potential downside for some students intersecting with a game like diplomacy?
Yeah, well, let's be honest. I can't always handle the emotional and psychological consequence of being stabbed. So, of course, it's going to be challenging for, developing minds and that type of thing. I would say this to that. In my experiences in my class, not every student has enjoyed the game or loved the game. And as I've grown in my 24 years of teaching, I think my first couple of years, I would have said, hey, come on, just get involved, get in, just give it a shot. And now I'm a little bit better of just knowing that, hey, you know what, you're fine. You're fine. This isn't your thing. And so it is important to understand that it can be uncomfortable in a way that's not growth. So that's important. But at the same time, the classroom is a safe space. You can make your classroom a safe space, and you can make this game a safe place to make mistakes and to be stabbed in a way that you can recover and learn from, or, those types of things. So there's good lessons to learn there. You mentioned the thing about like adults. I mean, that's a whole different thing. There's certain students who I think, man, if they were playing in my spot in some of these tournaments that I've been in and had got the reaction, that somebody might have gotten, I wouldn't want to put them in that situation. But at the same time, that may not be an age thing. I mean, that's also a personality thing.
Well, Chris, give us your perspective on that, because you and your group were playing when you were in 8th grade, but you all came to DixieCon when you were 14, so you played with adults, and that, as I recall, that was a DipCon year. That was a year we were the North American Championship host.
That's right.
So you played literally with all kinds of people from all kinds of places. So did you have any negative experiences as a 14-year-old in that environment?
Well, I certainly had very powerful experiences, and what Dave is kind of warning about, it really resonates with me, because I remember when I was leaving from that DixieCon, my dad asked me, how was it? And as I said, great, I just started sobbing, right? And I was crying and just like inconsolable. And he said, well, okay, so clearly you're not going back next year. And I was like, no, I really want to go back. And it took me a while to understand what was going on, but it was just kind of that emotional burden of having to be on alert to that threat of being betrayed, aggression from adults who were 2 or 3 times my size, right? Strong language. And it was tough, but I'd like to encourage people parents or teachers who are considering bringing their students or kids to one of these larger open events, that rather than trying to protect them from some of those things, I would say let them experience it and then debrief with them afterwards, right? Like, you heard someone using strong language. How did that make you feel? Do you think it was effective for them? Were they more or less convincing to someone else? Would you do the same in the future, right? I think those kind of discussions help us kind of push our limits and do move towards growth. And you don't really realize that you're not made of glass until you fall down and see that you don't shatter. So I would just encourage you to very clearly understand the distinction that Dave wanted to make between growth versus just uncomfortableness, but also, see which one it is. It might be a mixture of both.
That's good insight. Dave, how about some final thoughts for our audience about this subject, if you have any others?
From the teaching perspective, I would just say, if anybody's playing diplomacy, watching this because of it, you're in the same boat I am with some online stuff. There's so many different ways to be creative, and sometimes it fails and sometimes it works. But if you're trying, which I think that's what the kids see from me as I'm trying to do something, it just goes a long way, that effort to put in to find something creative.
That's great. Chris, how about you? Final thoughts for the audience?
Oh man, my entire life has been enriched through playing games, and the relationships I've made through playing games, and the traveling I've been able to do through playing games. I can't speak any higher of game playing in general, and diplomacy especially. I think it's a wonderful game, but you got to have your head in the right place for it.
All right, great, fellas. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you
for having us.
If any of our viewers want to find out more from Dave Roberts on the specifics of using the game in a classroom setting and to obtain his forms and written procedures on how to do it, please contact me at davidhood@dixiecon.com, and I'll make the connection for you. And now, for another segment about diplomacy and education, let's turn to an interview with one of the creators of the teaching module on the website Play Diplomacy. All right, Dipsy, welcome to the show. We're here to talk about diplomacy in the classroom. So before we do that, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got into the diplomacy hobby?
Yeah, sure, David. I used to play diplomacy with friends across the board. And then because I'm a programmer, I got hooked up with the guy who runs the site, the guy who owns the site. And I do it as a hobby, really. I've been doing it for, 10 years, 11 years, 12 years, something like that. Just as a hobby.
Well, that's what it is for all of us, although apparently some of us take it so seriously that we have a broadcast network after this particular hobby. But to tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the concept of using diplomacy as a teaching tool or in schools in general.
Well, it sort of, most of the stuff at Play Diplomacy has happened because our users, our players, have suggested changes. And we had some teachers starting to ask about using it as a tool. But we also had a desire as a site, because we have a lot of new players come in who don't know how to play. And we want them to become involved in the game and to enjoy it. And so we were looking for a way to do mentor games. Mentoring for new players. And so we set up this support, which we called schools, but it was really just for mentoring, where a teacher, that was the mentor, can be in the game, but not playing a country. And then all the other players, they can message the teacher if they want, they can ask him questions or her questions, and then they learn the game. So it was great. And then we had the teachers saying, well, hang on a minute, can we use that for our students?
So you are filling a market niche here that your own users created or told you about.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't go immediately according to plan, in that the teacher said, great, we'd like to use that support for our education, for our classes. And so they would get their students to sign up so that they could play on PlayDip. And we then had quite a lot of problems, because most of the people who play at PlayDip want to be here. But of course, students in a class were sort of coming here because their teacher had told them they have to. And so, as kids often do, I'm afraid there was a lot of messing around. They were joining games, they were messing games up and that sort of thing. So what we realized was we needed a different approach, and that's what we've got now. So what we've got now is the teacher registers the school, and then the teacher creates a whole block of what we call student accounts. And the important thing about those is they can only play on games that the teacher has created.
Hmm. That makes sense. That makes sense. And tell me how the rest of it works from there. Is there any other part of the module in Play Diplomacy after the games are set up and the teacher's monitoring the play?
Oh yeah, you know, we've listened to the feedback we've had, because we've got about, I don't know, it's something like about 250 schools, 300 schools signed up, although they're not all active at one time. And so the teacher's page now, the teacher can create blocks of accounts for the students. They can populate games by putting students in particular countries. Most importantly, one of the things they were very quick to ask for, they can now control when the turn processes. So they can say, okay, you can all do your communications, but when we have lesson time, I want to process it so we can then talk about it. So they can control that. They can see who's waiting and who's not waiting. And they also get a copy of every single message sent by every single student to every other student in the game. In other words, country messages, which we felt was very important because we treat cyberbullying very seriously at PlayDip. And obviously in this scenario, we would prefer the teacher to be responsible for that.
Sure. Well, obviously you're in the UK, I'm in the United States. Tell us a little bit about how this is being used in various countries. I mean, is it just, you know, a European thing? Is it just an American thing? Is it all over the world? Tell me.
It's all over the world. I think probably our biggest school with the most student accounts is actually in China. But there are people using it in all continents. And what I've been surprised by, I thought it would mostly be used for sort of 16 to 18-year-old type students. We've got classes of kids using it sort of as soon as they're really into secondary school, like sort of 13, 14-year-olds. And indeed, we've also got one diplomatic corps and a number of army users who are using it for their guys. I don't know what they're doing with it, but...
Well, that's it. We had a feature on Deadline News a couple of months ago about the fact that the Australian Army is using diplomacy as a teaching tool for their officers. It's fascinating what's going on around the world.
Yeah.
Do you have a concept of what types of classes are using diplomacy through your site? Is it a history class? Is it a civics class? Do you have any idea?
I don't know them all, but I know some of them. I know that colonial history was one thing that one teacher was looking at. Most of it is related in some way to either history or world wars or things like that. I wondered whether we'd see some people using it maybe on psychology courses or something, but I've not seen any of that.
Well, sometimes teachers use it as a way to teach their students social skills. In fact, the panel discussion that our viewers just watched has an example of that. A student whose teacher was using it as a way to get his group of friends, you know, sort of socially connected to the school, which was a fascinating way to use the game.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. So have there been any particular problems with the, other than the thing you said earlier about the students getting on before you sort of put your foot down on what exactly games they could join and stuff? Any other problems that teachers or students are having using the game in this way?
Yeah, there are a few. I mean, probably the most common one is teachers find it difficult to make sure that the students actually submit orders. You know, and I'm often being asked, oh, could you rewind that game by a turn because not everybody got their orders in? Well, that's pretty hard to do. And in the end, we just had to say to the teachers, look, if you control when the turn runs, in fact, since you own all the accounts and you set the passwords and the emails, you could actually log into all the accounts and make sure they put orders in. But more or less, you've got to make sure you say to them, look, you've got to put your orders in. I mean, if they don't, then surely that is also learning something, because obviously, you know, in struggles, when communications go wrong, then you often get disasters.
That's quite true. So on PlayDip in this particular sort of teacher model, is it just classic diplomacy or are there variants available?
We only allow it on classic diplomacy at the moment because we feel that, you know, it's a teaching tool.
Yeah.
Why would they need the other variants? So it is limited to just the classic variant.
Okay. Well, I want to say congratulations to Play Diplomacy for offering this service, not just to the hobby, but to the, you know, to the world of education. I think that's a great service that you're providing, and I think you should be commended for that.
Well, thank you.
Any other final thoughts for our viewers about Play Diplomacy or about your teaching module on Play Diplomacy?
I think we've probably covered most of it. I mean, we're still looking for ways to improve it. And we have had people requesting to play with things like Fog of War or some of the other modifications. But at the moment, we just left it and said, no, it's just the basic one. What we do find is quite a number of the students who are interested will then sign up with their own account and, become part of our community.
Well, that's certainly what we're hoping for, isn't it?
Yeah.
Dipsy, thank you so much for being on the show. And again, congratulations on a wonderful service to the hobby.
And thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly at davidhood@dixiecon.com. For our other broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.